Welcome back, all you listeners, to another episode of Untangling Climate Finance. I'm Jay Tipton from Gordian Strategies. In this episode, I connect with Sacha Spector, the Program Director for the Environment at the Doris Duke Foundation. He and I get into the details about the role of philanthropy in conservation finance and climate action. Philanthropy has always been a catalyst for change, funding initiatives that markets overlook and governments struggle to prioritize. But in today's climate crisis, its role is shifting, moving beyond traditional grant-making to strategic investments, policy influence, and bringing people together to drive solutions. As federal funding ebbs and flows with the changing of administrations, private foundations are stepping in to support land conservation, climate-smart forestry, and Indigenous-led stewardship. Sacha has spent his career at the intersection of science, policy, and philanthropy, working to protect landscapes and ecosystems while strengthening the conservation sector. At the Doris Duke Foundation, he's been leading efforts to scale land protection, restore forests, and build consensus on the future of conservation in the United States. We explore together how philanthropy can be more than just a funding source, how it can mobilize capital, support innovation, and push for long-term environmental solutions. Cool. Now, let's hear from Sacha. Hey, Sacha, welcome to Untangling Climate Finance. How are things your way?
We're doing all right here, Jay. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining. All right, so I always kick off every episode in the same way, and that is to hear a little bit about the guest. So why don't you tell me a bit about yourself, and you can kind of cover topics of where you're from, your career path, and then how you've landed at Doris Duke Foundation.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Hudson Valley of New York State, in a small town called Chester, actually. It's about 50 miles north of New York City and at the time, a farming community right on the edge of the Appalachians. That really inspired me to spend a lot of time outside, and that led to a career in environment. And so I'm a trained ecologist and conservation biologist, and I've had a career that has sort of evolved from research and academia toward practice and policy, and now into philanthropy. I've worked across tropical ecosystems and in some of the world's big natural history museums. Today, I mostly spend my time thinking about the health of the conservation community and the path forward for us here in the United States.
Very good. East Coast boy.
Yeah. Well, as I said, right on the edge of the Appalachians, and the Appalachian Trail was not far from me. So that had me thinking about big landscapes and the connection to big natural areas. And actually, that right before coming to Doris Duke Foundation, I was a science director for a regional NGO in the Hudson Valley called Scenic Hudson, where we worked on all sorts of land protection and environmental policy issues. And I was a grantee of the foundation a few times over, including support to help create a conservation strategy for the 4.5 million acre Hudson Valley region. And so when the director role here at the foundation came up, I think I had been supported across multiple parts of the program, and maybe that's what attracted the foundation to get in touch.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It is a beautiful part of the country, that is for sure.
It is. It's where the ocean and the mountains meet. It's the only places, where you can get through the Appalachians at sea level, and that really is an incredible biological intersection zone or a collision zone. It's a really spectacular place to grow up and get connected to nature.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So why don't you now tell me about the Doris Duke Foundation? What exactly is it? What are your key focus and funding areas?
Yeah, well, the Doris Duke Foundation is a 25-year-old, roughly $2 billion foundation created at the bequest of our benefactor, Doris Duke, at her death. We work to create a more creative, equitable, and sustainable world. And we work across three major areas: arts and culture, nature, and health and well-being. And one of the interesting things about the foundation is that we combine national grant-making programs with physical locations. We actually have a footprint on the ground in Hawaii at Shangri-La, which is operated as a center for culture and convening and cultural exploration, and Duke Farms in New Jersey, which is a 2,700 acre park and preserve where we combine regenerative agriculture, ecological restoration, and public programming to enable New Jersey citizens and people from all around the world really to connect with that place. And so that gives us a chance to kind of ladder up things that actually happen on the ground with the big picture of our national grant making programs.
Very good. And so is the nature program the same thing as the environment program, or are these two different pillars inside of the foundation?
Yeah, well, I think our interests in nature are actually a little bit broader than just the environment program itself. And so we think about the environmental stewardship work and the natural climate solutions demonstrations at Duke Farms as a key part of our nature work, and the programming that we do at Shangri-La that connects nature and culture and arts as a key part of our nature work. And then the environment program itself is the longest, maybe most prominent part of our nature strategy. And we've had a long track record of working on land protection, land restoration, and climate change for the last 25 years. We've helped conserve several million acres of land across the country, but we've also invested in some basic science and really foundational tools for the conservation community to help prioritize work, to help focus on the parts of the country that have the highest potential for both biodiversity and climate benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And we really think about our role as investing in the basic infrastructure for conservation here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And we take that really seriously.
Good to hear it in that context and kind of give myself a better, cleaner idea of how it's divided. And so I know that you have a variety of different programs and competitions at Doris Duke Foundation. Of course, you know that our audience here is in the climate finance space. And so that, of course, can be money that's going to natural climate solutions. It can be tech solutions. Given that context, are there any particular programs or competitions at DDF that you think you would like our listeners to hear about or to learn more about? Because I know you have some from searching your website, what's called the CRF Climate Resilience Fund, the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund. So floor is open to highlight a program or a competition that you think might be of interest to the audience.
Sure. And let me just back up a little bit to tell you a little bit more specifics about the components of our environment program before I jump into that, Jay.
Yeah, go for it, please.
At the Doris Duke Foundation, we think about driving within our three key areas our big ideas, the kind of outcomes that we're trying to drive on the ground and in the world. And for the environment program, our two big ideas, which really are initiatives, are Indigenous-led conservation, which aims at elevating the leadership and the role of Indigenous practitioners, tribes, and Indigenous-led organizations within the conservation field. And the second is climate smart forests, which is aiming to catalyze a national effort to protect, restore, and better manage forests across the country in order to meet key national goals on climate and biodiversity in the coming decades.
Nice. How many tribes do you all work with?
We're working with a number of federal agencies and tribes on co-stewardship and co-management areas, which is an approach in which tribes are able to access and consult with land managers at the federal level on how public lands that were formerly tribal lands are stewarded and managed, and contribute Indigenous knowledge and their perspectives and priorities about how those lands are managed.
That's great. That's an awesome initiative. I've spoken with a few other people in our space that are doing similar work, and I always applaud it because, of course, you know, there's a million reasons why. But from a stewardship perspective, you can't get any better than the people that know the land the best, right?
Well, absolutely. And they're drawing obviously from millennia of experience and observation and Indigenous research in a way. But it's also worth remembering that tribes own or control about 5% of the land area of the United States. And so ignoring their role in stewarding those places and contributing to national outcomes is really impossible. You really can't get to either national goals or very local goals without taking that into account.
Yeah, I mean, 5% of the continental U.S. is massive. I think people think 5% seems like a low number, but when you consider the size of the country, it's gigantic.
Absolutely. I mean, it places them above most federal agencies in terms of land ownership, and yet they're not resourced for the most part to do anything with those lands. anything close to the realm of what states and federal agencies are resourced to do.
Yeah.
The Navajo Nation, for example, has land area larger than West Virginia, and they just have a handful of natural resource professionals, as opposed to what a state like West Virginia has at its disposal.
Yeah, that's not even close to sufficient. Not even close.
Let me come back to your question about programs and competitions really quick, because I did want to mention two things that are very live.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'd point to the Innovation Hub that we're partnered with the Science for Nature and People partnership on. That's an RFP that's open right now until the end of March, I think. That will support 3 working groups to develop roadmaps for national conservation and climate goals. The idea is to bring together experts from interdisciplinary fields to imagine and map toward a nature positive future for the United States, whether it's protection goals like 30 by 30 or restoration goals or other threats to biodiversity. We don't have national goals here in the United States that are sort of established in the same way there are in other places through international treaty. And so this is an imagination exercise. And I'd encourage anyone who has an idea about how to work across boundaries of fields and expertise to look into that. And you can find that at the Science for Nature and People Partnership website. The other thing I'd point to is an open call for nominations to the 9th American Forest Congress, which we're co-hosting with American Forests and over a dozen steering committee organizations. That's in July this year, and it's only the 9th Congress since 1882 brings the forest community together to plot a path forward at a time of real challenge. And I think we'll get into that in a little bit in our conversation.
Sacha, I love it whenever I have a guest and they have ongoing or open RFPs, because it allows me to use this platform to then promote that. So, of course, once we get off this call, I'll make sure that I get the links to both of those so that I can keep them in the show notes and then promote them as I publish the episode later this month. So
that sounds great.
That's exciting, because it's always much more interesting when there's like action items for the listener to do or to share with other people in their networks. We'll be sure to share all of that on your guys' behalf.
That'd be great. That'll be really helpful. And we want to drive as much visibility to these things as we can. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. And so, yeah, as you said, I know that last year you guys worked with some of my colleagues here at Gordian Strategies to develop a strategic plan to advance your natural climate solutions initiative. From what I gathered from my colleagues, the plan focused on 3 key priority areas, including 1, building a national consensus to support climate smart forestry, 2, elevating science and standards to support climate smart forestry, and 3, modifying federal and state policies to incentivize climate smart forestry. So my question is, how are these priority areas currently progressing?
Yeah, well, first I want to just express my gratitude to Gordian Knot and say that we couldn't have gotten through our work resetting strategy in natural climate solutions without them. So there's a seamless plug for Gordian Knot and an endorsement from me.
Thank you.
Let me back up and just say that we know from really abundant science that addressing climate change is impossible without nature. There is just no plausible pathway to a 1.5 degree or 2 degree world without dramatically ramping up the role that nature plays in capturing and storing carbon from the atmosphere and avoiding emissions. And here in the US, that's certainly true. And nowhere is that more important than forests, which already absorb about 13% of our country's emissions every year. And we project that the total carbon sink from land could be doubled or almost doubled in time for our mid-century climate goals if we get really serious. And so the science is really clear that we need nature and we really need forests to play a bigger role in meeting our climate goals. Reforestation, natural forest management, and avoiding the loss of millions of acres of forest over the next few decades has this sort of largest mitigation potential of all of the natural climate solutions in the US. We think that we could add another 10% or more to the emission reduction potential of forests through a really concerted national effort. And so that's what our Climate Smart Forests Initiative is built to catalyze, is this national effort on protecting, restoring, and managing forests that will get us to goals like that by mid-century. And so the three strategies that you mentioned, we think are part of a pathway to that. First is building a consensus that really solidifies at the professional level and the political level and the institutional levels, an understanding that forests are under threat now. They're in a lot of ways at a tipping point where they will continue to be stressed and degraded by rapidly changing climate, or we lean in and help them adapt faster and help them recover from extreme events and things like that faster. So we need to really foster this consensus that we need a national effort on forests. It's not just about wildfire, although that's obviously a key part of the challenge and the political reality of how people think about forests. But we know that there have been decades of skirmishes in the forest community. And it's really easy to caricaturize that as cut no trees and cut all the trees. But the truth is that there's a ton of science and a lot of consensus that's already been building that we need a climate adapted, climate smart approach to forests in this country. So that's why we're convening the 9th American Forest Congress. We'll be working with partners from industry to the civil society and nonprofits to really map a course forward that in some ways gets out of the binary fight around forests that's happened for decades and tries to move us forward toward this agenda. The second part is elevating science and standards that actually enable practitioners, land managers, conservationists, and industrial forest owners to do a better job protecting, restoring, and managing forests. Because some of the techniques are evergreen, forgive the pun, but a lot of climate adapted approaches, our best management practices, aren't yet fully responsive to the pace of change or the thought process that it takes to manage a forest for future conditions, not past conditions. The third part of our strategy is around policy at federal and state levels that incentivize, that codify climate adapted, climate smart forestry. And I think, we had some really interesting experiences under the Biden administration, in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act, in which there were tens of billions of dollars directed to the land sector, but it was not really structured in the same way that the energy sector was supported through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm not talking about sheer magnitude. I'm talking about the sort of strategic construction of federal policy to accelerate progress in a sector. The federal dollars for the land sector were largely oriented through existing grant programs, not to catalyze new industry, not to catalyze new markets, not to catalyze new product. And that's quite different than the way the energy sector was structured. So we need new policies at federal and state levels that really think differently about what it takes to help push the forest sector toward a scaled and adapted posture on this, because it's not going to happen by funding a whole lot more of what we've always done.
And that's where DDF comes in, right?
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of challenges to shifting a political consensus and also shifting the policy space. We're still actually a little bit, we're well behind in some ways the energy sector's ability to model the impacts of policy on our sector and to actually be rigorous in designing approaches that take markets and behavioral economics as well as public sentiment into account so that we can get to some of these really ambitious goals.
Yeah, the public sentiment part's a major factor to it all. And obviously, as you know, policy, just by the nature of being policy, is kind of a slow crawling process generally.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think particularly in a very time-sensitive, time-limited context like climate change.
Yeah.
Where policy tends to move at the speed of lowest common denominator approaches as opposed to high ambition approaches. It's a mismatch.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is both help our sector understand what a really high ambition pathway would look like, and then help shift the window of what's possible, shift the window of what the sector is able to envision for itself and advocate for itself on. And that, I think, is an interesting challenge, is not getting too far ahead of the public or the sector with these ideas, but also working really hard to bring them along toward a higher ambition trajectory.
It's a delicate balance, but one that has to be struck almost perfect. It's tricky, no doubt. Sacha, given the selective focus required in developing the NCSI strategy that you have, I would imagine that there were areas that you probably wanted to address, but just couldn't fully do. Given that, what are some of the other key challenges in the climate smart forestry space that you think still need attention? And and if you are, how are you communicating those needs for others to potentially take them on themselves?
It's a great question. And like any other strategic planning process, there are things that wind up on the cutting room floor that are painful to leave behind.
Yeah.
But, I think that actually innovative finance was one of the things that we highlighted early on as a key need, but one that we weren't particularly well suited to lead on, simply because our own capacities and our own sort of track record in the space. And so we're working with a range of other funders and helping other partners grapple with that, including commissioning some work on the investment space for forests in the U.S., the opportunity for novel finance vehicles like interim finance, loan guarantee pools across philanthropy. So we're in conversation on this, but it's not one of the spots where we really are able to take a leadership role. Another is, and this is related in some respects, is a kind of forest product R&D or innovation prong, where there are a number of opportunities for making forests more valuable or changing the basic business model for forest management through marketing novel products, specific forest products, but also, non-timber products like biodiversity or carbon credits. And those kinds of market dynamics or market mechanisms are also something that we're not digging into really deeply, even though we know they're going to play a really critical role in onboarding a lot of private capital into the space.
I mean, obviously, as you said, you can't do it all. And although it's painful to chop some stuff, of course, it doesn't mean that it has to be the end of the road for those. It could be passing the baton or assisting in other ways. So it's good that you guys have realized that and also dedicated some resources, at least if it's mental power, to helping others push that along.
Absolutely. And the great news is we're not alone in this. We are leaning on our colleagues across philanthropy who are doing amazing things really in the carbon market space or the credit market in general space. And we really couldn't do it without them taking the leadership role. And I'm thinking about foundations like the High Tide Foundation, the Bezos Foundation, Zoma Labs are all really helping move the ball down the field on some of these hard questions around other value markets.
I mean, we certainly cannot be working in silos, and those are great foundations, the three you just listed. So to be leaning on them as partners or as colleagues it's a strong bunch.
That's right. And so one of the other pieces of work that we're being a lot more attentive to these days is trying to convene philanthropy and help build a shared view of this challenge, and to understand that we each have a role to play in the grand approach, in the grand strategy, right? So having a shared strategy doesn't mean that we're all doing the same thing. It means that we're able to have a shared analysis, but differentiated roles within that. And I think we're working really hard with a bunch of other partners to try to bring that perspective to philanthropy in general.
And you actually kind of segued me perfect into my next question, because of course, as we had said, the first priority area for your natural climate solutions initiative is building the national consensus. I would say that one of your strengths at DDF is your fantastic reputation, but then another strength is also your capacity for convening. So in that priority area, one of building consensus, those both will go a really long way in helping you achieve that. And so I guess what I'm curious is, in your opinion, how do you believe that core competency of the capacity for convening in the whole sphere of building consensus, how did that come about at DDF?
I think I'll try to answer that at two levels. One is sort of about philanthropy in general, and that is that philanthropy is independent capital, and it enjoys, in most cases, the benefit of not having to raise money, but also therefore not having to sort of rep ourselves in the same way that NGOs need to. I don't mean that to denigrate NGOs or their role. It's just that as a pool of independent capital, we have a differentiated position in the community that allows us to act completely as a fiduciary for the ideas and the goals that we are trying to drive together. And that gives us a chance to bring people together around topics. It also means we can support both sides of a question. We can support a range of viewpoints on a topic that's of importance to us. And that puts us in a convening role almost by default, which is not to say that we're neutral. And I don't think philanthropy at its best is a neutral actor, just that we're able to be a vessel for the community that individual organizations within the community are not as easily. TDF is really leaning into our convening role in all of the work that we do across all three areas. And we think that's really, really important for a few reasons. And we've come to that role, come to having our reputation as a convener, because we really do a couple of things. One is, I think we try really hard to be responsive to the communities we're working with and seeking to serve. We have long grant relationships with some organizations. We have newer partnerships with others, but we work really hard to listen and be led by the field in a lot of cases. Doesn't mean that we don't have our own independent perspective and aren't trying to advance things, but we work really closely with the community. The other, and as this is especially for the environment program, is we try to be really rigorous, and we've always been a science-based program. We set some foundational guardrails around topics. We try to gather the best information we can and then help the community synthesize that into a path forward. And so I think that gives us a chance to be not just an honest broker, but a contributor to the growing consensus on a challenge, whether it's on forests or Indigenous-led conservation or any of the other things that we've worked on over the years.
It's definitely challenging, but I feel like you guys, it's a historical thing, right? And so being a name and carrying the reputation that you have is something that, as you said, it can build on itself over time, and using that as your strength, of course, allows you to be a leader in a lot of ways and opening doors and having conversations simply because of the fact that it's a respectable foundation that people know.
Well, as I said, I think it is one of the ways that philanthropy can really contribute. I think it's also a responsibility that philanthropy carries by dint of its sort of role. And that is just to enable the field to do things that it can't do individually.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, Sacha, the last question I have, second to last question, of course, like we have to go here regarding the current political landscape, because we've talked about funding coming in from the Biden administration in the last 4 years. But obviously, the current Trump/Musk administration is impacting a lot of people in our space, whether that's climate exclusively or environment or nature, all of it, of course, it's linked. I think that if anybody would have said that they were prepared a couple months ago for what was coming, now we would say nobody was prepared nearly enough. And so I'm curious, and this is up to you to go as deep or as wide or as far as you want in your response, but in your view, what are some of the most important challenges or risks that we all should be mindful of and prepared to address with the new administration and their attitude towards environment?
That's a big question. So let me just start by saying that I recognize this is a moment when a lot of core assumptions actually about the role of the federal administration and the health of civil society in environment and every other topic is under question, and what the future looks like for our work in environment and so many other really, really critical issues. I think without getting into questions about whether the current administration's actions in downsizing federal agencies are legal or not, or any of these kind of separation of power questions, what we're experiencing in the environmental sector right now is a handful of things. One is a sudden disappearance, or at least suspension, of a huge amount of capital. And that is jeopardizing a lot of forward progress on projects and work that was midstream. And more fundamentally, that capital is compromising civil society. So I think we really have a question about the health of civil society over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months and whether we will see really significant downsizing or even closure of some environmental organizations, NGOs across the spectrum, actually. So that's something that we're really worried about, right? I mean, especially in philanthropy, we work with partners on the ground and NGOs around the country. And if they're not able to survive this, we're in real trouble. So that's kind of like this ability to operate problem that we're experiencing now. And while we may see some resolutions as a result of legal challenges and the like, there's no question there's going to be damage done. And what future funding looks like from the federal government is a huge question. So I think there's another really key risk that we have to be looking at, and that's that the information that we rely on from the federal government and civil society, to the extent there's federal support for information production, is also at risk. So there's a lot of authoritative information that's created and held and distributed by the federal government that we all rely on. And those data sets many of them are being archived, but their accessibility is in real question. So yeah, I think that's a real core challenge. We need to be really quickly responsive and also working together to make sure that as much of that information is available and that information and projects like the National Nature Assessment, which we were really looking forward to, are able to continue even though they're not federal projects anymore. Yeah. And I think that the kind of most macro risk, and I don't really even know how to think about this, but is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that as federal agencies are degraded in their ability to deliver on their missions, it reinforces the narrative that they're not good at doing that. And that you can see the reinforcing spiral that can lead to. And that's something that I think all of us, not just in philanthropy, need to be cognizant of and working to head off. Yeah. So all of that is super rosy. But it's also really worth recognizing that there's a lot that hasn't changed and that there's a lot of the basic realities of climate change and biodiversity loss haven't changed from 2 or 3 months ago. The key issues that we're all working to address have not disappeared. And their incapacities at the state and local levels and in the NGO space that are really suited to keep moving the ball forward. And so we've been down this path before. It clearly didn't look quite like this time around, but we found ways to be really productive during the first Trump administration, in some cases with the federal level, but also working with states and cities on initiatives around the country. And I'm really confident we'll be able to do some of that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that positive spin on it at the end because I do think you're right. I think that obviously when we run into adversity, humans in general and groups, when we put our minds together, are often very adept at being able to then re-navigate and reorient. And sometimes it can be positive. Natural disasters, things like this really have a way of pulling people together and helping us and kind of forcing us in some ways to find more strategic avenues forward. But it only kind of strengthens oftentimes the motivation or the inspiration to do it. So I think you're right. I think that certainly during the first administration, a lot of states stepped up, a lot of governors, and I think we're going to see that again. I think you're right on the money.
Yep.
And as you said, it also kind of just reinforces the fact that, there's a role and there's a space for philanthropy and other groups to step in.
Absolutely. When we look ahead, we're drawing on a couple of key data points. One is that the public is behind climate action and the public is actually behind conservation with incredibly strong numbers. And that actually cuts mostly across the political spectrum. This is a spot where the politics and the polity are in two different places. And so we really do have to work on bringing those things back into alignment where the politics reflect what the people in this country want on environmental issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our big initiatives are really, we're going to continue driving them as strategically and responsibly as we can. And we were always trying to build big tent solutions on these challenges. And so we're going to keep following the science and we're going to keep trying to build consensus around the path forward on this. I think this moment also creates a base in which we have to foster imagination about what comes next. What comes next from a spot where maybe the federal agencies don't have the capacities they once did, or that the bedrock laws have been erased or changed. And that gives us a chance to imagine what the next version of that framework could look like, because I don't think anybody listening to this podcast went into the Trump administration thinking that our kind of bedrock laws and our environmental framework in this country were working perfectly, right?
Right.
I think we're all working to perfect them. Now we have a chance in a certain way, not a blank slate, but certainly to be even broader in our imagination about thinking of the next iteration.
Yep. When the iron is hot, it's time to strike.
Yeah, or build plans for further out into the future, one or the other.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And of course, yeah, the magnitude and the speed of which everything is changing is requiring that kind of, not a system reset at all, but certainly a reimagination, as you said. So I'm right there with you. And I do think that, again, in the conversations that I've been having with people or that I've been listening in on, there's a greater sense of motivation and purpose, all things considered, the last 2 months, which is positive.
Absolutely. I mean, imagination in times like this is maybe our most precious resource.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good one. All right. So, Sacha, it's time to close out, and I like to do it with some philosophy. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "What concerns me is not the way things are, but the way people think things are." And we're going to modify this just slightly to be more catered towards what you do. And so my question is, what do you think is one thing that must be done to change how people think about climate finance, or more specific to DDF, about philanthropic funds, which is, of course, a part of climate finance, and its role to address climate and environmental issues?
If you'll indulge me, I've got two answers to that. One is, I think we need to change people's minds and enable a lot more creativity and risk tolerance for non-grant making use of endowment resources, especially in the land sector. In other words, like enabling and encouraging finance, not funding, from endowments. People often conflate the two, but really we're used to funding and we're not used to using our endowments for finance. And I think we really have to lean into that. The other thing that I think we really need to shift in philanthropy as we think about climate finance is we've got to internalize that the time value of climate action and of carbon is exceptionally skewed. And the assumption that philanthropic capital will be as useful in the future as it is today is highly overvalued, in my opinion. And so understanding that the opportunity cost of current returns in our endowment versus future losses, I just don't think that philanthropy has quite really understood how critical and time sensitive deploying capital in this moment is.
Brilliant. That was brilliant. And I will echo those sentiments. So I appreciate that, Sacha. Well, that's it. The clock is ticking on the end of the episode. Sacha, I appreciate you taking 45 minutes out of your day today to walk us through what you guys are doing and to share a little bit about DDF. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
It was really a pleasure talking, Jay. Thanks so much for having me on.
Likewise. Take care.
Take care.
Nice one, Sacha. I'm sending a massive thanks to him for joining and sharing his perspective on the evolving role of philanthropy in conservation and climate finance, as well as about the great work the Doris Duke Foundation is doing. Sacha mentioned several initiatives throughout the episode, including the American Forest Congress and the Innovation Hub RFP. You can find links to both of those in the show notes. And before you go, I kindly ask that you do not forget to subscribe and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're on Spotify, tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Also, be sure to explore our other podcast content and check out our weekly newsletter, Sliced, for bite-sized updates on climate finance, conservation, environmental policy, impact investing, and a lot more. Catch you next month for another deep dive into climate finance. Thanks for listening, and take it easy. This podcast is brought to you by Gordian Strategies.